Discuss whether tradable permits are an effective solution to correcting market failure and reducing carbon emissions. In this essay, I'm looking for a definition of tradable permits, a definition of market failure, and how they could reduce carbon emissions. I'm also going to be looking for diagrams that can be used to explain tradable permits. Since we're looking at it as an effective solution, we're going to look at the for argument for tradable permits, the against, and we're also going to consider an alternative, which is what I'll be looking for. So let's get started. Tradable permits allow polluters to emit a certain amount of pollution, and if unused or partially used, can be sold to others. Increased carbon emissions are an example of market failure. This is where the free market fails to achieve an efficient allocation of resources. Okay, the only problem here is why are increased carbon emissions bad? Let's move on to the next paragraph. Tradable permits are an effective way of correcting market failure as they attempt to achieve government objectives of reducing emissions. By having a set amount of pollution allowed by the government, the demand for tradable permits increases and so does the price, encouraging firms not to pollute as shown on the diagram below. There seems to be a little bit of a gap here. There's a set amount of pollution allowed by the government, then you jump to a demand for tradable permits increasing along with price. So not a very clear explanation. Then we're going to move on now to the diagram. Okay, so we have a completely inelastic supply curve for the tradable permits, demand curves shifting to the right in D and D1. I've added the labels for price and quantity, and I've also added the label for Q here. But there was some issues initially with the diagram, so that needs to be labeled correctly. But I think at the basic level this diagram is correct, but with inaccurate labeling. Okay, when the demand for permits increases from D to D1, quantity supply is fixed, but the price of permits increases from P to P1. The P and P1 are not labeled. A tightening of pollution standards can be shown by a shift left of the supply curve. This method of controlling carbon emissions should achieve the government's desired environmental outcome consistent with the country's maximum level of permitted emissions. Again, the explanation's okay, could be better. What we're talking about here, tightening pollution standards, shifting the supply curve left, is something that's different to demand increasing for tradable permits. One of the advantages is that it rewards firms who pollute less as they can earn money by selling their permits to less environmental firms. It should also result in the price of permits increasing to such an extent that even the richer firms will start to look for ways to reduce their carbon emissions. Such as what? There should be some further explanation there. However, there are limitations to pollution permits. Firstly, the government can only make an estimate to what they think is the acceptable amount of pollution being created. There can also be a problem calculating and actually distributing permits to polluters. The cost of enforcing and making sure that firms have sufficient permits to cover their pollution may also be a problem. I would say this is pretty good, talking about the drawbacks. Hopefully we see more coming later in the essay. An alternative way of reducing carbon emissions is by legislation and regulation. This would mean the government could monitor firms on their pollution levels. Firms would be encouraged to abide to the restriction in order to avoid getting a fine or having their business closed. This would decrease their demand to create carbon emissions. Again, I think that it's the wording that's a little bit shaky here. What I'm looking more for this part to say is that firms would face increased costs. A discussion of how it increased their firm's costs and influence their decisions in polluting. Okay, we have a supply and demand diagram. Let's see what the explanation is. Again, missing labels for price, quantity, equilibrium price, new equilibrium price. The leftward shift of demand curve from Q to Q1 caused by the restriction of emissions causes the new price to increase from P to P1. Now, the leftward shift of demand curve should occur from D to D1, not Q to Q1. The leftward shift of the demand curve caused by the restriction of emissions causes a price to increase from P to P1 and quantity demanded to drop from Q to Q1. The new equilibrium moves from PQ to P1 Q1. Now, I'm not necessarily sure if I like this diagram for this explanation. If they're going to be using legislation and regulation, generally the argument is that it makes it tougher for business to do business, right? So it's going to increase their costs because they have to adhere to the new directives by the government, and that would shift the supply curve left. So the fact that this demand curve is shifted leftward, I don't necessarily agree with the logic behind it. In theory, legislation and regulation should correct market failure caused by carbon emissions. However, not everyone will abide to the law. There will also be the problem of the cost of enforcement. Similar to pollution permits, the government would have to make an estimate to the value of the acceptable amount of pollution allowed. On balance, I think that pollution permits are the most effective way of reducing carbon emissions, as they internalize the cost of polluting, unlike laws and regulations, as their cost of enforcement is likely to be paid for by taxes. They also have a benefit of rewarding more economic firms. I'm not sure what actually was meant here, but I'm not really over the top happy with this essay, mostly because the analysis becomes unclear at points. The basic definitions are there, the discussion, the context, yes. The analysis, the drawbacks are pretty clear. The advantages and the explanation with diagrams, not so much. So while I'm looking at a mark to give this, initially I've awarded it 15 at first glance, but I'm going to go back and change this based on what I see here. So knowledge and understanding is present. Explanation, application. We need more explanation as of the market failure resulting from pollution. A thorough analysis of tradable permits and examination of an alternative. With improved labeling and diagrams and stronger analysis, I'd say, not just further, stronger analysis, this would improve. Evaluation is reasonable and evident throughout. The final conclusion seems brief. I am leaning towards, for this one, if I consider, I would say at best this is going to earn 13 out of 18 marks, because the analysis is really weak at points and incorrect sometimes, really. So 13 I think would be generous. I could see the argument being made for 11 out of 18 towards 13 out of 18 marks for this one. And that I think was being generous.